Later on in the week, around Thursday night, he takes the disciples to a dinner. And they have dinner together, and he tells them over dinner, somebody here is going to betray me. And they say, nah, not us, never us. But Judas is there, and he slips out quietly. And he goes and he gets a party of men together. And while he's gathering those men, Jesus takes the disciples, and they begin praying in the garden. And Jesus prays this really strange prayer. He says, God, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. I don't know that I can handle it. It wasn't the death he was speaking of. It wasn't the shame or the guilt. It was the fact that in a matter of hours, for the first time in his existence, he would be separated from God by sin. There would be a moment on the cross where the world would turn dark because God the Father, for the first time, broke that relationship with his son, had to turn his back on him because of the sin, my sin, that came upon his shoulders. So he prays, and he begins bleeding and sweating. And their prayer time is interrupted because Judas shows up. Now hear me. Instead of going into Jerusalem and taking over, he doesn't. He does nothing. And then when Judas shows up, Jesus could have fended for himself. Peter does. Jesus doesn't. He says, no, that's not how we handle things. Let them take me. He allows them to arrest him. Now, I want to remind you, he's the Son of God, okay? He walked on water. I'm pretty sure he could have worked his way out of some handcuffs, out of some chains, out of some situation, but he doesn't. He doesn't. He lets them take him. They take him to the first of many trials, and at each trial, there are just some bogus lies going on. And Jesus could easily say, that man's not credible. He could begin telling the people the lies this man has told, and he could begin revealing even the thoughts of their heart in that moment, but he doesn't. He doesn't. When asked to speak up for himself, he does nothing. Do you hear me? Do you understand what I'm saying? All along the way, he does nothing. When every disciple abandons him, he does nothing. When the charges are leveled against him, he does nothing. They take him out of those trials, those mock trials. He goes up before the Roman ruler. He goes up before Pontius Pilate. He goes before the Jewish ruler, Herod. Nobody wants to deal with him, and he doesn't stand up for himself. Pontius Pilate says, well, the crowd's going crazy. Just beat him up a little bit. So they take him out, and they put a cloth over his face, and they punch him and beat him in the face and say, who hit you? And he says nothing. He knew who hit him, but he did nothing. They ripped his beard out, clump by clump, and he does nothing. They took him and they tied him up against a post. And it wasn't just any post, it was designed to do this well. He was hunched over this post, maybe about this height, maybe a little taller. And when they tied him up, they did it in such a way that his back was fully stretched. All of his muscles were completely stretched. And these Romans, who were very gifted at torture and persecution and physical harm, they got this whip that had glass and nails and broken bones and rocks. And these guys were really good. The historians say these guys were so accurate. It was a long whip, maybe 15 feet long. They could whip someone and rip their ear off and not touch their face. They were good at what they did. You hear me? So they stretch him out across this thing, and they whipped him once, twice. And every time they would whip him, pieces of his back would come out. And it wasn't uncommon when this would take place for pieces of bone to be ripped from your rib cage. And he does nothing. Or maybe he cried, maybe he groaned, maybe he was in pain, but he didn't defend himself. He doesn't call God in heaven to his rescue. He doesn't call the angels down to defend him. He does nothing. Nothing at all. And when that was over and they still weren't satisfied, Pontius Pilate finally says, you know what, just you do whatever you want with him. And the crowd that cheered for him begins screaming, crucify him, crucify him. Not Barabbas, not the thief, not the murderer. Kill him. And so Pontius Pilate washes his hands. Says, I'm not responsible for this. You know that's a Hebrew tradition, that washing the hands? In the Old Testament, when there was a murder or a death in the camp, and they couldn't find who did it. They couldn't find any reason to believe it was this person or this person's fault. After a certain number of days, the high priest would come out with a basin of water, and he would wash his hands, and it was his way of ceremonially cleansing the crowd and saying, none of us are guilty because we can find no nobody to persecute, nobody to try. So we're all going to move forward and forget about this. So Pontius Pilate, a non-Jew, performs a very religious ritual, thinking that is going to absolve him and the crowd from what's about to take place. Jesus stands there. Pontius Pilate says, man, aren't you going to say anything? Nope. So they take him, they put him on a cross, and he does nothing. And they began mocking him. They began mocking the very fact that he was doing nothing. They began crying at him, hey man, I thought you were the Son of God. Why don't you call some angels? Why don't you come off that cross if you're who you say you were? And he could, but he did nothing. And by doing nothing, he did the one thing that was necessary for everyone. The one thing that none of us could do. By doing nothing, he did something greater than anyone had ever lived or done. He did the one thing that we had to have done. He lived a perfect life, which none of us could do. He did nothing starting out. He did no sin. And then he did nothing and allowed himself to be crucified on that cross. Because that was the one thing we needed more than a heroic leader, than a great spokesman, than a world conqueror. We needed in 2016. They needed in AD 33. We needed someone to bear the weight and the punishment of what separates us from God.